They always warned young Omegas that destiny never knocked politely. It crashed into your life when you were least prepared. The first bell of the Moonrise Festival echoed across Blackwood Citadel, just as the morning fog lifted from the ancient pines, revealing towers carved from pale stone that shimmered beneath the early sunlight. Every 10 years, wolves from every allied territory gathered beneath the Alpha King's banner to celebrate unity, renew sacred vows, and honor the balance between strength and compassion. The festival was famous for its music, silver lanterns, and breathtaking ceremonies, but everyone also knew there was another reason people whispered about it long after it ended. During the celebration, heightened instincts often stirred among unmated wolves, making emotions stronger, sense sharper, and even the calmest souls feel unusually overwhelmed. That was exactly why Evelyn Carter had accepted the least noticeable job she could find. She wasn't a noble. She wasn't a gifted healer or an admired warrior. She was simply an Omega assigned to deliver fresh flowers, refill water pitchers, and quietly disappear before anyone important noticed she existed. She preferred it that way. Invisible people rarely became the center of embarrassing stories. At least, that was what she believed when the morning began. Evelyn adjusted the basket resting against her hip as she hurried through one of the marble hallways connecting the royal gardens to the ceremonial courtyard. White roses, blue moon lilies, and silver fern leaves filled the basket with a gentle fragrance that almost hid the countless scents drifting through the enormous palace. Laughter echoed beneath towering ceilings. Noble families greeted old friends. Young wolves admired polished armor and elegant gowns while musicians rehearsed beside crystal fountains. Everything felt carefully planned, every smile practiced, every movement graceful. Everyone except Evelyn. She nearly tripped over the hem of her plain blue dress while avoiding two palace attendants rushing in the opposite direction. A few nearby servants laughed softly, and her cheeks warmed with embarrassment. "Easy there, an older cook called kindly. The festival hasn't even started." Evelyn managed an awkward smile before continuing toward the courtyard. She only needed to replace the flowers beside the royal platform and then return to the kitchens. Simple, quiet, forgettable. Exactly the kind of day she liked. But the closer she came to the platform, the stranger the atmosphere became. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with invisible energy. Wolves paused in conversation, lifting their heads as if listening to a distant melody only they could hear. Royal guards exchanged cautious glances without speaking. Somewhere beyond the carved stone archway, a deep ceremonial horn sounded once, long and steady. The Alpha King had arrived. Evelyn lowered her eyes immediately. She had never seen Adrian Blackwood up close, only distant glimpses during public celebrations. Stories described him as fearless in battle, impossible to deceive, and surprisingly calm despite carrying responsibilities that would exhaust ordinary leaders. Others claimed his silver eyes could read every secret hidden behind a smile. Evelyn had no desire to test whether any of those stories were true. She slipped behind a row of towering marble columns, hoping to finish arranging the flowers before anyone noticed her. Her hands moved quickly, placing white roses into polished silver vases while trying to ignore the growing warmth spreading through the courtyard. It wasn't painful. It wasn't frightening. It simply felt unfamiliar. She took a slow breath, reminding herself to stay calm. Festivals always stirred emotions. Everyone said so. She reached for the final arrangement just as cheerful applause erupted across the courtyard. Startled, Evelyn instinctively turned toward the sound at the exact moment another young Omega hurried past carrying folded ceremonial banners. Their shoulders collided. The basket slipped from Evelyn's hands. White roses scattered across the polished stone. She stumbled forward, reaching for anything to steady herself before falling. Time seemed to slow. A firm hand caught her arm. She looked up, startled by the unmistakable silver eyes meeting hers from only inches away. Alpha King Adrian. Blackwood stood perfectly still, his dark ceremonial cloak shifting gently in the morning breeze. Before Evelyn's racing thoughts could catch up with reality, the overwhelming surprise triggered pure instinct. She leaned forward without meaning to, seeking balance more than anything else, and in one impossibly awkward heartbeat, she accidentally caught the edge of his high ceremonial collar with her teeth. The courtyard fell completely silent. Hundreds of stunned eyes turned toward them as Evelyn froze in absolute disbelief, realizing she had just become the one person in the kingdom who had transformed the most dignified royal ceremony into the most unforgettable accident anyone would be talking about for years. Silence spread through the royal courtyard so completely that even the fountains seemed to stop singing. Evelyn Carter remained frozen where she stood, her fingers still lightly clutching the edge of Alpha King Adrian Blackwood's ceremonial cloak, while every terrified thought crashed through her mind at once. She stepped backward so quickly that she nearly lost her balance again, her face burning with humiliation. "Your Majesty, I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind moving through the silver banners overhead. Around them, the royal guards instinctively shifted into position. Their polished armor reflected the morning light as anxious nobles exchanged stunned glances. Several servants quietly covered their mouths, convinced they had just witnessed the shortest career in palace history. No one dared speak another word. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the Alpha King, waiting for the judgment only he could deliver. Adrian slowly lifted one gloved hand toward the place where Evelyn had accidentally caught the edge of his high collar. His expression remained unreadable as his fingertips brushed the slightly rumpled fabric. For one endless heartbeat, even the birds nesting along the palace walls seemed unwilling to make a sound. Then, to everyone's complete disbelief, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was enough to send a ripple of confusion through the entire courtyard. "Interesting," Adrian said calmly. His deep voice carried effortlessly across the marble square. Instead of anger, there was quiet amusement hidden beneath his words. Evelyn blinked, uncertain she had heard correctly. She had prepared herself for dismissal, punishment, or at the very least a stern lecture about palace etiquette. A smile had never entered her imagination. One of the senior commanders cautiously stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "shall we escort the servant away?" Adrian looked at the commander for only a moment before returning his silver gaze to Evelyn. She lowered her eyes immediately, unable to meet them for more than a second. There was something unsettling about those eyes. They did not simply observe. They seemed to notice every nervous breath, every uncertain heartbeat, every emotion she desperately tried to hide. "No," Adrian answered simply. "She stays." A wave of whispers spread through the gathered guests before fading just as quickly beneath the commander's raised hand for silence. Evelyn slowly looked up, certain she had misunderstood. "Your Majesty?" she asked softly. Adrian studied her for another quiet moment before speaking again. "You appear to have a remarkable talent for creating unforgettable entrances." Color rushed back into Evelyn's cheeks. "It was an accident." "I know." His answer came so quickly that it caught her off guard. There was no accusation in his voice, only certainty. That almost makes it more impressive. A few members of the royal council exchanged puzzled looks. None of them had ever heard the Alpha King joke during an official ceremony. Adrian turned toward the assembled crowd as though nothing unusual had happened. "Continue the festival." His calm instruction instantly released the tension gripping the courtyard. Musicians hesitantly resumed playing. Servants hurried to gather the scattered flowers. Nobles slowly returned to polite conversation, although many continued glancing toward Evelyn with open curiosity. She wished the marble floor would simply swallow her whole. As she bent to collect the last of the white roses, Adrian stopped beside her. His shadow crossed the polished stone before she noticed his boots only inches away. She carefully held out the final flower she had managed to rescue. "I believe this belongs beside the platform," she murmured. Adrian accepted the rose without taking his eyes off her face. "Perhaps," he replied. "Or perhaps it belongs to the person who nearly caused my entire royal council to forget how to breathe." Evelyn stared at him, completely speechless. Another faint smile appeared before he turned toward the palace entrance. After only a few steps, he paused without looking back. "Report to the East residence after sunset," he said. "You will be assigned temporary duties there." Evelyn's heart dropped. Temporary duties in the royal residence could mean almost anything. Before she found the courage to ask another question, Adrian added one final sentence with effortless calm. "Do not worry, my little disaster. I would like to know how someone manages to turn one ordinary morning into the most memorable ceremony I have attended in years." He continued walking before she could respond. The words lingered in the quiet air long after he disappeared beyond the towering doors, leaving Evelyn surrounded by hundreds of confused faces and one impossible question that no one, including the Alpha King himself, seemed able to answer. Why had the most powerful wolf in the kingdom chosen curiosity instead of anger? By the time the sun slipped behind the western mountains, Blackwood Citadel had transformed into a sea of silver lanterns that floated gently above every courtyard, their soft light reflecting against polished stone like scattered stars. Music drifted through the cool evening air while laughter echoed from distant banquet halls, but Evelyn Carter heard almost none of it. Every step toward the East residence made her stomach tighter with uncertainty. She had spent the entire afternoon replaying the ceremony inside her mind, hoping she had imagined the Alpha King's invitation. Unfortunately, every servant she passed reminded her that it had been painfully real. Some stared with open curiosity. Others whispered behind careful smiles. A few simply shook their heads, convinced that whatever strange fortune had protected her that morning could not possibly last another day. The East residence stood apart from the grand halls where nobles celebrated. Instead of glittering ballrooms, it overlooked quiet gardens filled with moon lilies and ancient oak trees whose branches swayed gently in the evening breeze. Royal guards opened the carved wooden doors without speaking, silently guiding Evelyn into a spacious library lined with towering shelves that stretched almost to the ceiling. Hundreds of books rested beneath warm golden lamps, and the rich scent of cedarwood replaced the noise of the festival outside. She had expected a courtroom. She had expected stern advisors and endless questions. Instead, she found peace. At least for a moment. You arrived on time. Adrian Blackwood's calm voice broke the silence before she even noticed him. He stood beside a wide window overlooking the gardens, no longer dressed in ceremonial robes. His dark coat was simple, almost ordinary, making him appear less like an untouchable ruler and more like someone who had quietly stepped away from the weight of the crown for a single evening. Evelyn lowered her head immediately. Your Majesty. Adrian closed the book resting in his hand and studied her with the same quiet attention that had unsettled her all morning. Tell me something, Evelyn Carter. She blinked. You know my name? I prefer learning the names of people before deciding what kind of person they are. She did not know how to answer that. Instead, she simply nodded. Adrian walked toward a small table where 2 cups of warm herbal tea waited beside a plate of fresh bread and fruit. Sit. Evelyn hesitated. I do not think I should. That was not a suggestion. His voice remained gentle enough that she almost smiled despite herself. Carefully, she took the nearest chair while trying not to appear nervous. Adrian poured tea into both cups before taking the seat across from her. There was no throne, no raised platform, just 2 wooden chairs facing each other beneath the soft glow of hanging lanterns. You have been wondering why you are here, Adrian said. Yes. Good. That means curiosity still outweighs fear. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the warm cup without drinking. Everyone believes I offended you. Adrian looked thoughtfully into his tea. Everyone enjoys believing dramatic stories. And the truth. For the first time that evening, Adrian smiled openly. The truth is that you were the only person I met today who acted without pretending to impress me. Evelyn stared at him in complete disbelief. I embarrassed myself. Exactly. He leaned back comfortably. Every noble in the courtyard spent hours rehearsing perfect greetings. Every advisor carefully selected each word before speaking. Every guest hoped to earn my attention. He looked directly at her again. You were simply trying not to fall. She laughed before realizing she had done so. The quiet sound surprised both of them. Evelyn quickly covered her mouth, horrified by her own lack of formality. Adrian only chuckled softly in return. There it is. What? Your real smile. Her cheeks warmed again. I am afraid I do not understand you, Your Majesty. Most people do not. A gentle knock interrupted the conversation. An elderly steward entered carrying several folded documents. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly when he noticed Evelyn sitting across from the Alpha King. Adrian accepted the papers before calmly giving his next instruction. Beginning tomorrow morning, Evelyn Carter will assist within the East residence until the festival concludes. The steward blinked. Personally, Your Majesty? Personally. As you wish. The The steward bowed before quietly leaving the room, although the astonishment on his face was impossible to hide. Evelyn slowly turned back toward Adrian. Everyone will misunderstand. They already do. Rumors will spread. They already have. She sighed helplessly. Then why keep me here? Adrian stood and walked toward the open window where cool evening air carried the fragrance of blooming moon lilies into the room. After several quiet seconds, he answered without looking back. Because something unusual happened this morning. Evelyn lowered her eyes. It was only an accident. Adrian remained silent long enough that she almost believed he had not heard her. Then he quietly touched the edge of his ceremonial collar, now neatly folded across a nearby chair, and spoke almost to himself. Perhaps. His silver eyes reflected the moonlight as he looked into the dark garden beyond the glass. Or perhaps some accidents arrive exactly when destiny grows tired of waiting. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale mist that drifted through the royal gardens like quiet memories refusing to fade. Blackwood Citadel had settled into a calmer rhythm after the excitement of the opening ceremony. Yet Evelyn Carter quickly discovered that peace inside the palace was often more unsettling than chaos. Every servant she passed offered respectful greetings, but nearly all of them waited until she had walked away before exchanging curious whispers. She pretended not to notice. It was easier that way. Her new responsibilities were surprisingly ordinary. She organized correspondence inside the East residence, refreshed flower arrangements in the private library, and helped the elderly steward prepare meeting rooms before members of the royal council arrived. No one explained why the Alpha King had assigned such simple work directly under his supervision, and no one dared ask him. Even Adrian himself behaved as though everything were perfectly natural. He thanked her whenever she brought tea, occasionally asked her opinion about the books decorating the library, and once spent nearly 10 minutes listening while she explained why moon lilies always bloomed more beautifully near running water. It made no sense. Kings were supposed to command armies, negotiate treaties, and make impossible decisions. They were not supposed to ask an unnoticed Omega whether white flowers looked better beside blue ones. Yet Adrian listened with genuine interest, as though every answer mattered. By the third day of the festival, Evelyn found herself relaxing just enough to stop expecting disaster every time he entered the room. That was exactly when something even stranger began. She was arranging fresh branches inside a tall crystal vase when an unexpected wave of sadness washed over her so suddenly that she nearly dropped the flowers. The feeling did not belong to her. She had awakened cheerful that morning, encouraged by the peaceful sunrise and the kindness of the palace gardeners. Yet this emotion arrived without warning, quiet but unmistakably real. It lasted only a few seconds before fading as quickly as it had appeared. Evelyn pressed one hand against the edge of the table, taking a slow breath. Perhaps she had simply become tired. Festivals demanded long hours from everyone working inside the palace. She convinced herself not to think about it again. Less than an hour later, Adrian entered the library carrying several reports from the council chamber. He greeted her with his usual calm nod before placing the documents onto a polished desk. Then he paused. His silver eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Are you feeling unwell?" Evelyn looked up in surprise. "No." "What?" For a moment, he hesitated, almost searching for the correct words. "You seemed unusually troubled." She smiled politely. "Only for a moment." Adrian continued watching her longer than usual before quietly returning to his work. Neither of them mentioned it again, but the strange moments continued. Sometimes Evelyn would suddenly feel an unexpected burst of confidence while dusting old bookshelves, only to discover minutes later that Adrian had successfully concluded a difficult council meeting. Other times Adrian would pause during conversations, glancing toward the window with quiet distraction, just as Evelyn found herself laughing outside in the gardens with the palace children who chased butterflies between blooming roses. The emotions never lasted long. They arrived like distant echoes before disappearing into silence again. Neither of them understood why. Late that afternoon, rain clouds gathered above the mountains, covering the sky in gentle shades of gray. Adrian stood beneath the covered terrace overlooking the gardens while Evelyn hurried inside, carrying several baskets before the rain could reach them. She nearly slipped on the damp stone, but caught herself just in time. Adrian instinctively stepped forward anyway. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. Without warning, both of them stopped moving. A calm warmth spread through Evelyn's chest, replacing every anxious thought with unexpected comfort. Across from her, Adrian slowly lowered the hand he had reached out to offer. His usually composed expression softened with unmistakable surprise. It lasted no longer than a single breath before the feeling quietly disappeared. Rain finally began falling beyond the terrace, filling the gardens with the gentle sound of water dancing across leaves. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them seemed capable of explaining what had just happened. From the shaded walkway nearby, the elderly steward observed the silent exchange without interrupting. His weathered face grew unusually thoughtful as his gaze lingered first on Evelyn, then on the Alpha King, before slowly drifting toward the ancient silver moon crest carved above the palace entrance, where symbols far older than the kingdom itself had remained untouched for centuries. The gentle rain lingered through the evening, leaving the palace gardens glistening beneath hundreds of silver lanterns that reflected across rain-soaked pathways like scattered moonlight. Evelyn Carter tried convincing herself that the strange warmth she had shared with Adrian Blackwood beneath the terrace had simply been her imagination. It had to be. There could not possibly be another explanation. She returned to her usual duties the following morning with quiet determination, carefully arranging correspondence inside the East residence before helping prepare the council chamber for an important gathering between neighboring Alpha territories. The atmosphere throughout Blackwood Citadel had changed. Festival celebrations continued outside with music, friendly competitions, and family reunions, but inside the palace, conversations became noticeably quieter. Visiting leaders arrived carrying maps, reports, and sealed letters. Royal advisors walked with greater urgency than before. Something important was unfolding behind closed doors, although no one expected a servant to understand the details. Evelyn had nearly finished placing fresh flowers along the council table when she noticed Adrian standing alone beside one of the tall windows overlooking the eastern forest. His posture remained perfectly composed, yet there was an unusual stillness about him, as though his thoughts rested somewhere far beyond the horizon. Without understanding why, Evelyn suddenly felt the same quiet concern settling inside her own heart. It arrived gently, carrying no fear, only the unmistakable feeling that someone she cared about was carrying far too much responsibility alone. She stopped arranging the flowers and looked toward him. At that exact moment, Adrian slowly turned in her direction. Their eyes met across the room. Neither of them spoke. The shared feeling faded almost immediately, replaced by the ordinary silence of the chamber. Adrian offered the smallest nod before the council members entered, ending the strange moment as quickly as it had begun. Throughout the meeting, Evelyn remained outside the chamber with several attendants, serving tea whenever requested. She never heard the entire discussion, only scattered words drifting through the heavy wooden doors. Trade routes, harvest supplies, border patrols, weather forecasts, ordinary matters of leadership. Yet every so often Adrian's calm voice rose above the others, steady and reassuring, restoring confidence whenever disagreement threatened to interrupt the conversation. Hours later, the meeting finally ended. Advisors departed one by one, thanking the Alpha King before disappearing into the busy hallways. Evelyn quietly stepped inside to collect empty cups and organize the room for the evening. Adrian remained near the long council table, reviewing several handwritten notes beneath the soft glow of afternoon sunlight. "Long day?" she asked before realizing she had spoken without thinking. Adrian looked up, surprised for only a moment. Then he smiled. "You can tell." Evelyn hesitated. I'm not sure. It just seemed that way." Adrian rested one hand upon the stack of documents. "Curiously, I was about to ask whether you were tired." She blinked. "Why?" "Because for a brief moment this afternoon, I felt as though someone nearby desperately needed to sit down and breathe." Evelyn slowly lowered herself into the nearest chair. "That happened." Adrian raised one eyebrow. "It did. Only for a minute. I became lightheaded while carrying books." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The coincidence felt too precise to dismiss so easily. Before either could continue, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. The elderly steward entered carrying a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue cloth. His expression remained unusually serious. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, This was discovered during preparations for tomorrow's heritage exhibition. It was stored inside the oldest archive beneath the Western Tower. Adrian accepted the box with careful curiosity. The wood appeared ancient, its carved surface decorated with a silver crescent moon surrounded by intertwining vines unlike any royal crest currently used in the kingdom. As he gently lifted the lid, both he and Evelyn instinctively leaned closer. Resting inside was a weathered parchment covered with elegant handwriting so old that much of the ink had faded beyond recognition. Yet one sentence remained perfectly clear, preserved as though time itself had refused to erase it. Adrian read the words aloud in a calm voice that nevertheless carried unmistakable surprise. When two hearts begin sharing emotions before they understand the reason, the moon has already begun writing a future neither of them can escape. The room fell silent once more as Evelyn felt the now familiar warmth quietly return, and this time neither of them could pretend it was only coincidence. The ancient parchment remained open upon the polished oak table long after the last rays of sunlight had faded beyond the palace windows. No one in the room hurried to speak. The words seemed to linger in the air, settling quietly into every corner of the library, as though they had been waiting centuries to be read aloud once more. Evelyn Carter looked at the faded ink again, hoping a second glance would somehow reveal a simpler explanation. Instead, the elegant handwriting only appeared more deliberate, more certain. She slowly lifted her eyes toward Adrian Blackwood. His calm expression had not disappeared, but she noticed something new beneath his usual confidence. Curiosity. Genuine curiosity. He carefully closed the wooden box before turning to the elderly steward. Where exactly was this found? The steward folded his hands respectfully. Behind a sealed shelf beneath the Western Tower, Your Majesty. The archivists believe it has remained untouched for generations. Several old records mention a collection of moon chronicles, but most historians assumed they had been lost. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. Arrange for every remaining volume to be brought here tomorrow morning. Immediately, Your Majesty. After the steward quietly departed, silence returned once more. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while distant festival music drifted through the gardens, reminding them that the kingdom continued celebrating completely unaware that an old mystery had begun unfolding inside the palace. Evelyn finally spoke. Do you believe the parchment? Adrian answered honestly. I believe ancient traditions often preserve truths long after people forget why they were written. She lowered her gaze. Then what if those words are describing us? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the wide window overlooking the moonlit gardens where silver lanterns reflected across quiet pools of rainwater. If they are, he said at last, then rushing toward conclusions would only create confusion. Evelyn appreciated the steadiness in his voice. Unlike everyone else who seemed eager to invent rumors, Adrian refused to let fear or excitement replace reason. The following morning, 3 respected historians and the oldest spiritual elder in Blackwood arrived inside the East residence carrying carefully preserved manuscripts wrapped in blue velvet cloth. The elder, a graceful woman named Miriam Ashcroft, studied the wooden box in complete silence before gently placing one weathered hand across its carved moon crest. Her silver hair shimmered beneath the morning light as she slowly opened one of the oldest books. Delicate illustrations filled its pages, showing ancient Alpha rulers standing beside companions beneath a glowing full moon. Finally, Miriam stopped at a passage that made her thoughtful eyes soften with recognition. This has not been seen in many lifetimes, she whispered. Adrian stepped closer. What does it mean? Miriam looked first at him, then at Evelyn. Long ago, before kingdoms were divided by titles and expectations, there were stories of a rare moon bond. It was never forced. It could not be chosen. It revealed itself quietly, beginning not with grand ceremonies, but with shared emotions, unexpected trust, and ordinary moments that slowly became impossible to ignore. Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken. Can anyone create it? Miriam smiled gently. No. According to the oldest records, people only recognize it after it has already begun. The room grew still once again. Adrian exchanged a quiet glance with Evelyn, and for a single peaceful moment, they both felt the same calm certainty settle between them, gentle as morning light across the palace gardens. Neither of them spoke, yet both understood they had reached the edge of a truth far older than either of their lives. And somewhere deep within the forgotten pages still waiting to be opened, the rest of their story had already been written. By the afternoon of the fifth festival day, the quiet discovery inside the East residence could no longer remain hidden behind library doors. Rumors traveled through Blackwood Citadel with astonishing speed. Some claimed the ancient chronicles had revealed an extraordinary blessing. Others insisted the stories were only forgotten legends that curious minds had mistaken for truth. Evelyn Carter avoided every conversation she could, keeping her attention on simple tasks that had once brought her comfort. She arranged fresh flowers, delivered letters, and organized shelves that no longer needed organizing simply to keep her thoughts from racing. Yet wherever she walked, she felt eyes following her. They were not cruel, but they were searching, trying to understand why an ordinary Omega had suddenly become the center of whispered conversations among nobles and advisors alike. Adrian Blackwood noticed the change as quickly as she did. During the morning council session, several respected leaders asked careful questions about the recovered chronicles instead of discussing trade agreements. No one openly challenged the Alpha King, but curiosity had become impossible to ignore. After the meeting concluded, one senior council member approached Adrian with measured respect. "Your Majesty, the kingdom values stability above all else. Ancient legends should be studied carefully before they influence public expectations." Adrian nodded calmly. "That is exactly what we are doing." Another advisor hesitated before adding, "Perhaps it would also be wise for the young woman to return to her previous duties until the scholars finish their work. It may prevent unnecessary speculation." The room fell quiet. Adrian looked toward the open doorway where Evelyn was carefully gathering empty teacups, completely unaware that the conversation had turned toward her. His answer came without hesitation. "She will remain exactly where she is." The advisors exchanged thoughtful glances. None of them argued further. Adrian rarely repeated a decision once it had been made. Later that evening, Evelyn found him standing in the palace gardens beneath an enormous white oak whose branches stretched toward the rising moon. The festival music sounded distant now, softened by the breeze moving through thousands of silver leaves. She stopped a respectful distance away. "I heard people talking today," she admitted quietly. Adrian turned with the familiar calm expression she had come to trust. "So did I." She lowered her eyes. "If I am creating difficulties for the kingdom, I can leave the East residence. I never wanted to become anyone's problem." Adrian smiled gently, almost amused that she still underestimated herself. "Evelyn, do you know what the greatest responsibility of a ruler is?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Protecting the kingdom." "Yes," he replied. "And that includes protecting people from fear disguised as good judgment." She looked at him in surprise. Adrian stepped closer, stopping several feet away beneath the glowing lanterns. "You have done nothing wrong. You will not be punished for other people's uncertainty." A peaceful silence settled between them as moonlight reflected across the quiet garden paths. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Evelyn allowed herself to believe his words. At that very moment, Miriam Ashcroft watched from the covered terrace nearby. The elderly elder quietly opened one final volume from the Moon Chronicles and found a single passage marked with a faded silver ribbon. She read it only once before slowly closing the book with a knowing smile. "The first sign is shared hearts," she whispered to herself. "The second is the choice made before the truth is fully understood." She lifted her gaze toward Adrian and Evelyn standing beneath the ancient oak, realizing that without fully understanding why, the Alpha King had already made that choice. The final evening of the Moonrise Festival arrived beneath a sky so clear that every star seemed close enough to touch. Silver lanterns lined the palace terraces, their gentle glow stretching across the gardens where families gathered for the closing celebration. Music floated through the cool night air, and laughter returned to the citadel with a warmth that almost erased the tension of the previous days. Almost. Inside the East residence, the oldest scholars continued examining the remaining Moon Chronicles, while Adrian Blackwood quietly reviewed their notes. Every newly translated page echoed the same message in different words. The bond described in the ancient records could not be forced, imitated, or commanded. It revealed itself through trust freely given, steady kindness, and two lives that gradually began moving with the same rhythm. Evelyn Carter read several passages herself, but each answer seemed to uncover two new questions. She still struggled to believe that someone as ordinary as she could appear in stories preserved for centuries. "You are thinking too loudly again," Adrian said with a gentle smile as he closed another manuscript. Evelyn looked up in surprise before laughing softly. "I did not realize thoughts could make noise. Yours usually do." She shook her head with an embarrassed smile. "I keep expecting someone to explain that all of this is one enormous misunderstanding." Adrian rested the ancient book upon the table. If it were a misunderstanding, it would have disappeared days ago. Before she could answer, Miriam Ashcroft entered, carrying one final scroll wrapped in faded white ribbon. Her expression was peaceful, almost joyful. "We have finished comparing every surviving record," she announced. Adrian stood, and Miriam carefully unrolled the parchment across the table. A beautifully painted illustration appeared, showing an alpha ruler and his companion standing beneath a full moon, while silver light connected their hands like flowing water. Beneath the artwork rested a single line written in elegant script. Miriam read it aloud. "The kingdom will recognize the bond long before the two hearts fully understand it." Silence settled over the room once again. Adrian slowly turned toward Evelyn. "That explains the council." She nodded thoughtfully. "And the servants. And the gardeners," he added with quiet amusement. Evelyn blinked. "Even the gardeners?" Adrian laughed softly. "Apparently everyone except us noticed we had already stopped behaving like strangers." Her cheeks warmed, but this time she did not look away. Instead, she smiled with genuine ease, remembering countless small moments she had dismissed as coincidence. Shared emotions, comfortable silence, conversations that never felt forced, a growing sense of peace whenever they happened to stand beside one another. None of it had arrived dramatically. It had simply become part of ordinary life. Later that evening, the closing ceremony began beneath the ancient white oak overlooking the palace gardens. Nobles, warriors, servants, and visitors gathered together as musicians performed the final song of the festival. Adrian addressed the crowd with his usual calm confidence, thanking every family who had traveled across the territories to celebrate another year of peace. When his speech ended, applause echoed across the gardens. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Miriam remained quietly beneath the old tree, watching moonlight spill through its branches. She looked toward Adrian and Evelyn standing side by side near the lantern-lined path, speaking with effortless familiarity that neither of them seemed to notice anymore. The elder smiled to herself. The oldest chronicles had been correct. Destiny had never arrived with thunder or spectacle. It had entered the kingdom disguised as an awkward accident, grown through ordinary kindness, and quietly transformed two separate lives until standing together felt as natural as breathing. Somewhere high above the palace, the full moon emerged from behind a passing cloud, bathing the gardens in silver light that seemed almost to welcome the future waiting just beyond the final night of the festival. The morning after the Moonrise Festival felt different in ways no celebration could explain. The palace had grown quieter as visiting families began their journeys home, yet an unmistakable sense of hope lingered throughout Blackwood Citadel. Servants smiled more freely. The royal gardens seemed brighter beneath the early sunlight. Even the ancient white oak standing at the heart of the courtyard appeared almost majestic, as though it had silently witnessed another chapter of history unfold exactly as it had centuries before. Evelyn Carter resumed her work expecting life to return to normal, but she quickly realized that normal no longer existed. People still bowed respectfully to Alpha King Adrian Blackwood, yet when they greeted her, their expressions had changed as well. There was no mockery, no uneasy curiosity. Instead, they offered quiet kindness, recognizing the same gentle strength that Adrian himself had seen from the beginning. Later that afternoon, Miriam Ashcroft gathered the remaining scholars inside the royal library and carefully placed the Moon Chronicles back into their carved wooden chest. "Some stories are preserved so future generations remember great victories," she said softly. "Others are preserved so they never forget that true greatness begins with ordinary compassion." Adrian listened in thoughtful silence before closing the lid of the ancient chest. "Then let these remain where they belong," he replied. "Not as instructions for the future, but as reminders that destiny often reveals itself through the smallest acts of kindness. As the scholars departed, Evelyn joined Adrian beneath the old white oak where their unusual journey had quietly begun. The breeze carried the familiar fragrance of moon lilies through the peaceful gardens. She smiled as she looked toward the palace entrance where new servants hurried through their daily routines, each convinced their own lives were too ordinary to matter. "Do you think they will ever believe a story like ours?" she asked. Adrian looked across the courtyard before answering with the same calm confidence that had steadied her from the very beginning. "Perhaps not today, but someday another frightened soul will believe that one embarrassing mistake defines their entire future. When that happens, I hope they remember that one unexpected moment can also become the beginning of their greatest blessing." Evelyn laughed softly. "I still cannot believe all of this started because I lost my balance." Adrian's silver eyes warmed with quiet amusement. "Neither can I." He offered her his hand with effortless sincerity. She accepted it without hesitation, not because an ancient prophecy demanded it, but because trust had quietly grown between them one ordinary day at a time. Together they walked through the gardens beneath the morning sun while palace bells welcomed a new beginning for the kingdom. Behind them, the white oak stood silent beneath the endless sky, its branches gently swaying as though blessing two lives that had discovered the oldest truth of all. Real strength did not come from power alone. It came from choosing patience instead of pride, kindness instead of fear, and hope instead of judgment. Before anyone understood the meaning of the ancient chronicles, those choices had already transformed the hearts of everyone around them. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, another story was waiting for its own quiet beginning. If this story warmed your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next journey. Give this video a like to support more heartfelt stories. Share it with someone who believes kindness can change a life. And tell us in the comments, what do you think was the moment Adrian truly began to see Evelyn differently? And do you believe destiny sometimes arrives disguised as an ordinary accident?